This is Steve's 12th book, When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows. So I'll just start off with an observation, Steve, that our agent, John Brockman, describes third culture books. C.P. Snow's two cultures. There's the sciencey, technical books, and then the artsy, humanities books. And there's this gap in between. And since then, there's been like a genre of books that kind of combine them. That is, these are books written for everybody. Not the technical version and the pop version, but just the version that scientists read and anybody else could read. Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene is a model. Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, and most of your books. Do you think about that when you start writing? Like, I want to write for my colleagues and for everybody. How do I do that?
Yes, so I guess there are two questions. One is, what is the subject matter that I think will interest a wide range of people? And the other one is, how do I reach them? I did get advice from an editor when I was pondering making the transition. I wrote two highly technical academic books with university presses, and I was pondering crossing over to a wider audience. And an editor from Cambridge University Press said, the mistake that academics make when they decide to write for a larger audience is that they condescend to them. They think that they're writing for kind of children or people not very bright. And they think, how do I reach truck drivers and chicken pluckers? So it's a big mistake. When you are writing for a wide audience, you should assume that they are as smart as you are. They just don't know what you know. And that was a really good bit of advice. And I actually offered it in my own book on writing style, The Sense of Style. I offered that as the mindset that an essayist should take, that they sometimes called classic style, that the mental model that you have as you put words to it used to be pen to paper, but characters on the screen is, I'm with someone, I have seen something, they haven't yet noticed it, I orient them so they can see it with their own eyes. The style is conversation. The writer and reader are equals. That's the mental model. Then in terms of the subject matter, I do bridge the sciences and social sciences and humanities, not because I want everyone to get together and play nice, but just because for the kind of subjects that I write about, having to do in some way or another with human nature, they're all relevant. That is, human nature itself is a product of our biology, I have argued, of our evolutionary history, of our genetic makeup, of the functioning of the brain. But it is what gives rise to all the phenomena of the humanities. Music is a product of the human mind, and it is driven by our aesthetic sensibilities for auditory events, by our emotional calls, by our facility with language, by the way that the brain organizes the auditory world. Likewise, the medium of poetry and literature is language. The medium of art is visual perception. So I think for a really comprehensive understanding of any of these phenomena, and there's just no sharp point at which the science leaves off and the humanities begin. I think the division is partly there for the convenience of deans. They can put different people in different buildings, and students can take chunks of knowledge, and the university can send parents a bill, itemized bill. But at least for this, not for all subjects, but at least for the subjects that I most care about, I think all are relevant.
Yeah, I mean, you dabble in so many different topics. And this book seems to integrate a lot of them. I mean, just kind of making a list here of language and linguistics, psychology, game theory, rational choice theory, behavioral economics. What's the common problem you're trying to solve here using these different tools or avenues?
So for this particular book, the subject matter is common knowledge in a technical sense of the term. Common knowledge in this sense doesn't refer to something that everyone knows, but something that everyone knows that everyone knows. And it turns out that's a momentous distinction. So common knowledge is when I know something, you know it, I know that you know it, you know that I know it, I know that you know that I know it, ad infinitum. Why does that matter? Well, common knowledge is necessary for coordination, for two people to make choices that help them both as long as they make the same choice. Doesn't matter what the choice is as long as they are on the same page. And for that to happen, let's say rendezvousing for a coffee date. It's not enough to, let's imagine your cell phone goes dead and you have to guess where you're going to meet your partner. It's not enough to know that they like to go to Starbucks, because let's say they know that you like to go to Pete's. And so they'll go to Pete's to meet you, you'll go to Starbucks to meet them. Well, then you have a second thought, oh, well, she knows that I like to go to Pete's, so she'll go to Pete's after all. She's thinking, well, if he knows that I like to go to Starbucks, so he'll go there after all. And this can go on indefinitely. Only if each one knows that the other one knows that they know, and so on, can they coordinate. So the key idea is common knowledge is necessary for coordination, and human life depends on coordination. Everything from conventions, like driving on the right versus driving on the left. Again, doesn't matter which side you do, but it matters a lot that you all drive on the same side, and that everyone knows that you drive on that side. So I recount a joke where a woman calls her husband on his morning commute, and she says, "Be careful, honey, I've been listening to the radio. They say there's a maniac driving on the wrong side of the freeway." He says, "One maniac, there are hundreds of them." So conventions depend on common knowledge. Money depends on common knowledge. Why do you accept a green piece of paper in exchange for something of value? Well, because you can use it, someone else will accept it. Why do they accept it? Well, they know that still other people will accept it. And that works as long as it works. When it doesn't work, you get hyperinflation. And the pieces of paper aren't worth anything. But the extension that I make as a psychologist is that I think human relationships are also coordination games, like driving on the left or driving on the right or accepting paper currency. Namely, what does it mean for two people to be friends? It's not as if they sign a contract. If we're friends, it means I know that you know that we're friends, and you know that I know that you know that I know that you know that we're friends. And the common knowledge that cements a friendship are events like you go out for a meal together, you exchange Christmas cards, and so on. And likewise, a romantic relationship is a different kind of coordination game. A relationship in which one person defers to the other in a position of authority is yet another coordination game. Transactional relationships, yet another. And so a lot of our social life is driven by the need to generate the common knowledge that underlies a relationship, or in many cases, we actually have to do something that violates the common understanding of a friendship, and that's when you get all the phenomena of politeness, genteel hypocrisy, euphemism, pretending not to see the elephant in the room, all of these rituals of social interaction, which may seem arbitrary, we're just playing roles in a play, but I suggest are cases in which we actually want to avoid generating common knowledge. It's okay if I know it, it's okay if you know it, as long as neither of us blurts it out, we can keep the relationship. Anyway, we might get into that later, but I go into, in a couple of chapters, how that drives a lot of our social rituals.
Well, one of the fun examples you bring up is when Gourmet Magazine sent out a reporter to some Tony restaurants in Manhattan and said, on like a Saturday night at 7 o'clock where nothing's available, see if you can bribe your way in. It's like, ugh. All right. So, and he didn't fail once. So the lines are just classic, like, here's a 50 or whatever it is. I was just wondering if you had any, cancellations tonight. Or, tonight's a really special night for me and my sweetheart. Wondering if you, have any openings. That kind of thing.
Way you could shorten
now,
my wait?
why can't he just say, can I give you $50 for a table because, I really need this tonight?
Yeah, so that's one of the puzzles that I take up. It's one of several examples in which people don't blurt out what they mean in so many words, but they beat around the bush, they shilly-shally, they hint, they wink, they count on the listener to read between the lines, catch their drift, connect the dots. And so the question is, why do we do that? Why don't we just cut the crap and say what we mean? And this is what actually got me into the phenomenon. It was a fact about language that's long been known to linguists, that a lot of speech you can't derive the meaning simply by looking up the meanings of the words and the grammatical rules that combine them, like this, what's the subject, what's the predicate, because so much of our speech is indirect, even our polite requests, like if you could pass the salt, that would be awesome. Now, when you think about it, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It wouldn't be worthy of awe, and why are you, pondering hypothetical worlds anyway? Well, I mean, the reason in that case is you don't want to treat the other person like they're a servant. You don't want to be barking orders at them. And they do connect the dots. In the case of the veiled bribe, that's another case. You don't want to treat the maitre d', the ordinary social relationship that holds in that context, and social relationships are often specific to context, but in that domain, the maitre d' carries authority. He seats people when and where he pleases. If you were to offer a bribe in so many words, you'd be generating common knowledge that the basis of the relationship is transactional, fee for service, which challenges the authority relationship that he has. And one of the things that I note is when there are clashes of relationship type, that's when we experience the emotion that we call awkwardness. In mild forms, if it is too blatant and deliberate, it's outrage. And in fact, the way the article begins is this food writer, Bruce Feiler. The first words in the article is, "I am nervous. I am really nervous." As the taxi bounces over the potholes of Manhattan, I keep imagining the incensed words of an outraged maitre d', like, "How dare you insult me?" Or, "What kind of establishment do you think this is?" Or, "Do you think you can get in with that?" So the indignance, or in lesser form, the awkwardness, comes when there's a relationship mismatch. And that's what we try to avoid. So with innuendos, the diner knows what he's offering, and the maitre d' knows, but neither one can be sure that the other one knows. So the diner can always, if the maitre d' turns it down, which, by the way, as Michael, spoiler alert, it worked every time. 100% of Manhattan maitre d's are bribable. This is something that you might come in handy. But there could be doubt. Does he know that I know? Maybe he thinks, I'm kind of dense and I don't realize he's turned down a bribe, and the maitre d' could think, well, maybe he thinks I'm naive and I don't even know that I was being bribed. And so they can, if it's not consummated, they can go back to their relationship of deference to authority. Likewise, in sexual come-ons, the classic come-on was, you want to come up and see my etchings? Nowadays, I've been told it's Netflix and chill. But again, if it's turned down, then there's not plausible deniability of the intent, because any grown woman knows what "you want to come up for Netflix and chill" at midnight means. But there could be plausible deniability of common knowledge, which is generated when you blurt something out. So she could think, well, maybe he thinks I'm naive, and he could think, well, maybe she thinks I'm dense, and they can go back to being platonic friends, or even being supervisor and supervisee. Whereas if he'd said, hey, do you want to have sex? Then that does generate common knowledge, and they can never go back to the fiction of pure friendship, just like the diner and the maitre d'. There are also veiled bribes. I quote from an episode of The Sopranos, in which a member of the family approaches an old childhood friend and says, "Hey, Danny, nice to see you. I hear you're on the jury of the Soprano trial. It's an important civic responsibility that we should all take part in. You've got a wife and kids. We know you'll do the right thing." So we all recognize that as a veiled threat. Anyway, it's another example of this phenomenon of innuendo, and it's and in an earlier book, I proposed that common knowledge is the key difference between blurting something out and hinting at it by innuendo, and that's what kind of got me down the rabbit hole of common knowledge in general. That's when I learned that it's a big topic in philosophy and economics and political science and mathematical game theory, and that's what this book explores.
So when Harry Met Sally, where he kind of puts it out there and she calls him out on it, And then he said, okay, I take it back. And she says, you can't take it back. Why can't they just take it back and go back to the way it was?
So there's a good example here. And she says, it's out there. Now I find that significant because you may have been reacting as I kind of ran through the content. When I said that common knowledge consists of I know something and you know it, I know you know it, you know that I know that you know that I know that you know that I know it, you might think, well, wait a sec, how could that be the basis of social life? Your head starts to hurt after like 2 or 3 levels of I know that she knows, let alone an infinite number, which couldn't fit in a finite skull anyway. So the resolution of that puzzle is that common knowledge can be generated without having to do all of that thinking about thinking if something is public, conspicuous, self-evident, out there. If you and I witness something, and I witness you witnessing it, and you witness me witnessing it, that can generate common knowledge at a stroke. And we talk about it not using the term common knowledge in the technical sense, but using metaphors like it's out there, it's in your face, spill the beans. We refer to a conspicuous sound or object as a kind of metaphor for common knowledge, as in it's out there, and then you can't take it back. Or the elephant in the room, another metaphor, that refers to common pretense, where there's private knowledge, but common pretense. We're all going to pretend that what ought to be common knowledge isn't.
Right. Another favorite example from Fargo is where the criminals get pulled over by the cop. They got the woman tied up in the back, and he says, he pulls out his wallet, and he has his driver's license and a 50 kind of sticking up, and says, I was just thinking maybe we could take care of this here in Brainerd. And he can't say, I'll give you $50 if you just let us drive on, because then it's called it out. But there's a pretense like, all right, I'll take it or I won't take it, and we kind of know what's going on.
Well, and also, yes, and there it's, it involves a different human relationship, namely, with a police officer and someone pulled over, there's a very strong relationship of authority, hierarchical. You do what the cop says. If you're turning it into, he's like a salesperson and you're a customer, that's a very different way of thinking about a social relationship. It's a different coordination game is the way I would put it. And that's what was being challenged. That's what would make it, make someone nervous, is what would make it awkward, or even outraged. I cite another example, this one from the TV series Silicon Valley, where again, a driver is pulled over and one of the tech bros says, gee, officer, is there any way, so as they were waiting for the cop to approach the car, one says to the other, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they said that police are much more bribable than you would think. So he tries, he said, officer, I was wondering if there's some way we could make it go away. And the officer says, sir, I would think very carefully about the next words that come out of your mouth.
All right, so this...
Oh, I have to add one anecdote?
Oh, yeah.
So the night before The Stuff of Thought came out, my wife, Rebecca Goldstein, and I were strolling along the Brooklyn waterfront on the eve of my book tour. And beautiful September evening, the sun was going down, there's the New York skyline in front of us, and there's a lovely restaurant called the River Cafe on the Brooklyn waterfront. And Rebecca said, you should be the expert in bribing your way into a restaurant. You write about it. This is the book that's coming out tomorrow. Now, of all times, you should be able to get us in. And so, kind of like this food writer, it's a really nerve-wracking assignment. And I actually had a $50 bill in my wallet, which almost never happens. And so I went in and screwed up my courage, and I was defeated by the sight that greeted me at the maitre d' station, 2 maitre d's. So if I were to try it with one, it would be the common knowledge with the other. Maybe that's why they hired 2 maitre d's. So I was stymied.
So the fear of the one taking it would be that the other one thinks you are bribable, and you don't want that person to think you're bribable, even though you are, and they probably are too.
Yes, that's right. But if it was individual, then there would be the deniability of the common knowledge. But it was undeniable with the 2 of them
By the way, the other thing I learned from this book is that Ben & Jerry's has an ice cream flavor called Netflix and Chill.
Yes.
I guess we know what that means. Would you like to come up for some Ben & Jerry's ice cream? Right, okay. Why can't you just ask them? Okay. All right, so one of the themes, deeper themes here is Alan Fiske's 4 relational models. You've been hinting at these. So let's go over these. So these are human relationship structures that we have, more or less, for most of life. Communal sharing, which is relatives, couples, married couples, families, friends. You just commonly share. You don't keep track. You don't charge. Authority ranking, employer, employee, teacher, student, parent, child. Equality matching. This is like friends splitting gas, informal exchanges, roommates, sharing food, that kind of thing. Maybe some marriage stuff. And then market pricing, which is the modern world where you just pay for everything. So a lot of what you're talking about here seems to be tensions between these, where like if you went to a restaurant and ordered a meal and then afterwards invited the owner to come up for dinner instead of paying, what? Or your friends are over for dinner and they offer to pay you, you know, that would not be good. Or my favorite example from Woody Allen, when he in his stand-up routine from the early 60s, he says, this watch, my grandfather on his deathbed sold me his watch. Yeah, so there's violations of these kinds of things. I had my next door neighbors, my previous neighborhood, Val and Jim, I shouldn't have said that. Anyway, but I noticed she was driving his car at some point. I said, "Oh, you're driving Jim's car?" "Yeah, he sold it to me and he really screwed me on the price." I went, "All right, this marriage is not going to last," and it didn't. You know, so what's going on there?
Yes, so Fiske argues there are these 4 types. I actually have my own twist on the theory. There are really only 3, and that the 4th is very unnatural. The 4th being, he calls it market pricing, although I think it's related more to what Max Weber called the rational legal mode. I got that from Fiske himself in a footnote and ran with it. That life, when it's stipulated by rules and fiduciary duties and it's negotiated in prices, that's kind of modernity. That's the mode of organization that anthropologists sometimes call weird cultures, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, like ours. But that natural human relationships fall into these 3 types of communality, just share and share alike, authority, the alpha can boss around the beta, and equality or equity, kind of transactional relationships. And as we discuss these relationships and the clashes and the awkwardness, they come from mismatches among these 3 types. I think there's another mismatch that comes from the natural human tendency to fall into these 3 relationships: communality, equality, and authority, and the modern rule-governed systems that you see in things like accusations of nepotism, where, you know, in an ordinary human relationship, well, of course you dole out favors to the people you love, to your nephews and your brother-in-law. I mean, what kind of asshole would hire like a complete stranger over his own brother-in-law? But of course, in a modern organization, you hire the most qualified person, and if instead you hire your brother-in-law because your father-in-law forces you to, that's called nepotism, or corruption, or cronyism. And so a lot of the clashes or the anxieties and discomforts and discontents of modern life, I think, come from a clash between the natural human way of doing things. You dole out favors, you call in favors, if you have a position of authority, you use it to boss people around, versus the requirements, the fiduciary relationships that are stipulated in a rational legal model. And not coincidentally, what a lot of people have objected to in the Trump administration, especially the second one, is that he's flouting all the rules of avoiding conflicts of interest, not abusing power to consolidate his hold over the government, not use the powers of government for extortion. I mean, what he's doing is what any tribal chief, mafia boss, clan leader has done throughout history. We're supposed to unlearn that and actually follow checks and balances, rule of law. You only do what the law entitles you to do, and so on. And that's, I think, the clash that we're seeing there. But going back to the three models, each one of them probably comes from has a different evolutionary origin. The communal sharing is what happens when you share genes with your family members, share children in the case of a marriage, share interests in the case of a tribe or a clan. Authority comes from dominance hierarchies. Equity comes from reciprocal altruism. So they're biologically and psychologically very different. But each one, and to relate it to this book, is since they are all coordination games, there are ways in which you can get along with certain assumptions about how you share resources or not. I mean, there's another joke that illustrates the clash. A woman at a dinner party says to the hostess, "These cookies were delicious. I ate 4." And the hostess says, "You ate 5, but who's counting?" But that's the clash between a kind of transactional equity matching relationship and a communal sharing relationship where you're not supposed to count.
Yeah, well, so like something like prostitution, I mean, sex is in this communal sharing, presumably, category, where you do it because you want to do it. It's intimate, it's deep, it's important. And then shifting it to, I'll just pay you to do this for me. That's shifting to from communal sharing to market pricing. There's something that feels bad about that?
Yeah, well, a lot of our taboos come from applying a market pricing model to what ordinarily would be governed by one of these other relationship types, especially communal sharing. So prostitution is an example. Putting babies up for adoption to the highest bidder, selling babies, selling organs, like putting your kidney up for sale on eBay. And these are illegal, but that can change. So over time, it used to be that life insurance was considered to be immoral and outraged because the wife is betting that the husband will die. If he dies, she wins. If he lives, she loses, which is literally what life insurance is. And so the life insurance companies had to reframe it. That is, same transaction, but to put it in a different cognitive frame, namely a considerate husband cares for his family not only when he's alive, but even when he's dead. And that's how they kind of sold life insurance and broke that taboo, and it really was a taboo when it was introduced. But going back to the overall theme of the book, all of these relationship types, since they depend on common knowledge, I know that he knows, and that I know that he knows, they are cemented by some conspicuous event that both can witness at the same time as they witness the other one witnessing it. And each one of these relationship types has its own way of doing it. So for communality or communal sharing, there's body contact, hugs, handshakes, communal meals, kind of based on the model that you are what you eat. So if you eat the same thing, you are the same thing. Common modes of dress, of bodily mutilation like circumcision, scarring, tattooing, and so on. All of which, and interestingly, all of these are symbols. None of them are actually negotiated verbally. And the reason being that the whole idea in communal sharing is that there's this fusion. You just feel your communality with your lover, with your friends, in your bones. You're really the same kind of parts of the same superorganism. And if you were to negotiate it in language, that would undercut the very basis of the friendship, because friends don't negotiate the terms of their friendship. That's appropriate to the transactional or equality matching. What you have to convey, the common knowledge that these symbols convey, is fusion. In a religious community, in services, you stand up together, you sit down together, you bow together. The kind of exception that proves the rule is that in a romantic relationship, again, you don't, at least now we don't negotiate it in explicit terms, but there is the only way that language is used is in the ritual, I love you, and then reciprocated with I love you. And as a kind of backhanded evidence that this is perceived as a kind of common knowledge, I cite a Seinfeld episode again, alluding to the idea that common knowledge is conveyed in ordinary language, obviously not in the mathematical logic, but in the metaphor of a conspicuous sound or object. And so there's one scene in which George has been dating a woman and is pondering whether the time has come when he can say, "I love you." He has been kind of falling, and Jerry and Elaine say, well, gee, Georgie, that's a big move. Are you confident that you're going to get the "I love you" return? He says, 50-50. And Jerry says, because, if you say "I love you" and you don't get that "I love you" return, that's a big matzo ball hanging out there. So a big matzo ball, again, is a metaphor for something so conspicuous that you see it, the other person sees it, each of you sees the other one seeing it.
So in communal sharing, you're not supposed to really keep exact track of who's giving what. But I'll give you an example. So my wife and I we had this couple over for dinner 3 times, and they never invited us over to their house. And we're like, we're not keeping track exactly, but come on. What's the problem here, So there is kind of a level of keeping track, sort of.
Yes, there's kind of a long-term keeping track as a kind of protection against being exploited, because the problem with communal sharing is that you open yourself up to being exploited, as in that case. And there's a case where, again, a distinction between private knowledge and common knowledge. Close friends kind of know that, but and they probably each know that the other knows that, because we're all psychologists. We all know what other people are like. They're kind of like us. But it's very different if you kind of blurt it out, making it common knowledge. You've had us over 4 times. We've only had you over 2 times. That means we owe you exactly 2 dinners. Once we have 2 dinners, then we're fair and square. And you don't kind of have that conversation, but you do kind of mentally keep track. You kind of know that the other ones are mentally keeping track. A rough balance, doesn't have to exactly even it out. But again, the private knowledge preserves the relationship. Even the second and third order knowledge, and this is why when I defined it as, etc. ad infinitum and so on, it's because even a finite number of reciprocal states of knowledge is not the same as blurting it out. So in the case of tallying the dinner invitations, you kind of know that the other couple is probably doing that too. You might even know that they know you're doing it because they're no fools. But still, to actually spell it out, as in the case of the joke about the woman who says, I ate 4, and the hostess says you ate 5, and the punchline is, but who's counting? The point is that by counting, you are violating the ordinary terms of a communal relationship, especially if you make it common knowledge, if you blurt it out. If each one of you suspects the other, that can keep everything comfortable. So
another example, at this tennis club where I played doubles several times a week, it's understood that somebody's bringing a new can of balls for each match. There's 4 of us. And no one's keeping track exactly, but I noticed early on when I started doing this, this one guy always seemed to leave the can of balls at home or in the car. And then they started, but they didn't say, come on, how come you didn't bring a can? Hey, Bob, did you leave the can in your car again? It's a joke. You use humor to kind of lighten it, maybe, something like that.
Well, and part of the premise of Larry David's Curb Your Enthusiasm is that the Larry David character does blurt these things out. Right. And you kind of watch it. First you think, oh God, what an incredible jerk. And then some of the other characters in the show really do say that, like Susie, recurring source of humor. But he is anomalous in that what's funny about the show is that many of us are tempted to say those kinds of things, but we know not to in order not to threaten a relationship. Again, going in the context of the book, this would be the common expectations that define that kind of relationship.
Yeah. All right, so on the drive down here today, I was listening to Megyn Kelly, as one does, and she was ranting about Charlie Kirk. She didn't say, Tyler Robinson assassinated Charlie Kirk. She said, they killed one of ours, and we are not fucking around anymore. So what's going on there?
Yeah. There is a phenomenon. So in general, collective action requires common knowledge, because if there are many cases, and again, it's a coordination problem. If everyone in a movement stands up together, say to protest, they can be effective. There's safety in numbers, whereas if individual people do, each one of them can be kind of picked off or defended against. I quote a line. I'm not sure that the real-life Gandhi ever said it, but his character in the movie Gandhi at one point says to a British colonial officer, in the end you will leave, because 100,000 Englishmen cannot control 350 million Indians if the Indians refuse to cooperate. So it's a profound line. He could have said refuse to coordinate, but it does show the problem in challenging relationships of power. That as Gandhi pointed out, no government has the firepower to control every last one of its citizens. It can do so if it can intimidate them one at a time, especially if it controls the channels of communication. That is, there's no free speech, there's censorship, leading to a situation sometimes called pluralistic ignorance, which is a combination of private knowledge and common misconception. So pluralistic ignorance is the state in which everyone thinks that everyone else thinks something, but no one actually thinks it. And you can get that when expression of belief is punished. So in an autocracy, there can be a situation in which everyone detests the government, but no one knows that everyone does detest the government. Everyone could think they're the only one. And the secret to regime change is often coordinating protest so that everyone sees that everyone else hates the government at the same time, say in a public demonstration. That's why freedom of assembly is a fundamental right in a democracy, and autocrats are terrified by the prospect of people coming out en masse, each of them seeing the other, seeing the other. The most dramatic example might have been in 1989 when Nicolas Ceausescu, the dictator of Romania, had a public rally in which everyone was going to express their adoration of the dear leader. And one person started to jeer. And then the jeers spread contagiously until the entire 100,000 people were all jeering. And he was deposed and executed the next day. So that's the safety in numbers that can happen if there is common knowledge, if there is a time and a place where everyone knows that they can show up. So this often means that in a case where there's a diffuse discontent, it's crucial that there be some moment, some signal, some commonly known event that can get everyone on the same page. And something that Thomas Schelling pointed out, Thomas Schelling being a Nobel Prize winning political scientist, was one of the originators of the concept of common knowledge in many different guises, some of which I talk about in the book, including, by the way, he won a Nobel Prize for the doctrine of nuclear stability that quite literally saved the world. One of the things that he just noted in a footnote that popped out at me is that often an outrage incident is the key to coordinating collective action or collective resistance, particularly when there's no official leader of a group. So if a member of if someone gets attacked in a highly public situation and is seen as having been singled out for the attack because of his membership in some group, you often get then a kind of viral outrage spreading to the members of that perceive themselves to be the victimized group. They will often then, feeling that safety in numbers from the coordination triggered by the outrage, will then lash out kind of indiscriminately against members of the attacking group. And the result can be a pogrom, often when the outrage is even fictitious, like rumors that the Jews slaughtered a Christian boy to make matzah from his blood, which led to the Kishinev pogrom. It can be a real attack that then leads to a hugely unpredictable and disproportionate response, such as the Tunisian fruit peddler who set himself on fire to protest being harassed by the authorities, resulted in the Arab Spring and eventually the Syrian Civil War. Pearl Harbor, the explosion of the U.S. Maine in Havana Harbor, which led to the Spanish-American War, 9/11, which led to Iraq and Afghanistan, killing far more Americans than the original attack did, George Floyd, Rodney King, and most recently, Charlie Kirk. So even though he was slain by a kind of an internet-addled loner with a gun, outrage entrepreneurs kind of seized the moment to frame it as someone who was singled out because he was a member of the conservative coalition, because the killer had some kind of left-adjacent leanings. He had a transgender partner. He had some Antifa memes that he put on the shell casings. He then symbolized the great oppressor class of the left. And the result, at least so far, let's hope that it stops here, has been threats of a government crackdown on the entire left, right-wing version of cancel culture, where people have been fired, shamed, threatened, mobbed because they were insufficiently respectful of Charlie Kirk as a kind of martyr or saint. But all of these are the manifestations of this phenomenon of a communal outrage. By the way, the shelling, I mean, he just noted this in a footnote, one of many insights in a brilliant book called The Strategy of Conflict. But our friend, the late John Tooby, one of the founders of evolutionary psychology, was the one who kind of identified the entire syndrome. But just if I can throw in one more, there are a lot of jokes in the book, not because I just want to kind of entertain my readership who I fear might be turned off by all the game theory, but because jokes actually often are driven by a phenomena of common knowledge. So one of them from the old Soviet Union, which kind of illustrates this dynamic that we've been talking about, has a man handing out leaflets in Red Square, and of course the KGB immediately arrest him. They take him back to police headquarters, only to discover that the leaflets are blank sheets of paper. So they confront him. They say, "What is the meaning of this?" He says, "What's there to say? It's so obvious." So the point of the joke was he was generating common knowledge, that there was something subversive by people seeing him handing out the leaflets and accepting them and knowing why he was handing them out. Now everyone knew that everyone else knew that there was reasons to oppose the regime. And so, which is why both the Chinese communist regime now and Putin's regime in Russia will arrest anyone carrying a blank sign or handing out blank leaflets, because they know it really is subversive. Even without the content, it's generating common knowledge.
My other favorite joke from the book, the target of the joke could be anybody that doesn't have practical real-world knowledge, philosopher, an economist, or whatever. And so I'm about to play doubles tennis, and I'm introduced to this other partner, and she's a computational biologist at UC Santa Barbara. I said, "Oh, did you hear about the computational biologist that went to Montana and visited this sheep farm?" And she saw the sheep farmer there, and she said, "If I can tell you how many heads of sheep you have, can I have one of them?" And the farmer goes, "Yeah, okay." And the computational biologist, it could be a philosopher, an economist, blurts out, 83. And it's like, "Oh my God, that's right." And so the computational biologist grabs his prize and starts to walk off. And then he says, "Excuse me, if I can tell you your profession, can I have the prize back?" She goes, "Yeah, you're a computational biologist, aren't you?" She goes, "Yeah, how'd you know?" "Because that's my dog you're holding." Anyway, this woman could not believe I had a joke at the ready for a computational biologist, which of course it wasn't. What's the point of these kind of jokes?
Yeah, so in that case, it is to insinuate that these theoreticians, even though they call themselves biologists, are so out of touch with the living world, having spent their entire life just manipulating equations, that they wouldn't be able to tell a sheep from... Yes, I heard that from my colleague Martin Novak, a mathematical biologist. But in general, in humor, and there's a chapter in the book called Laughing, Crying, Blushing, Staring, Glaring. And it's about nonverbal displays that I argue are evolved because they're common knowledge generators. In the case of laughing, you know you're laughing because your breathing is interrupted, your hearers know you're laughing because they can hear the ha ha ha. In the case of crying, you're looking at the world through literally a veil of tears, while your partner can see the glistening in your eyes or the trickle down your cheeks. In blushing, you feel the heat in your cheeks from the inside at the same time that you know that someone is seeing the reddening from the outside. And it's, in blushing, if you recall the last time you blushed, you know that the reason that it's so painful is that as you feel the heat in your cheeks, you know other people can see you blushing. Made all the worse when they say, "You're blushing." In fact, if someone says, in lab studies, if someone actually says, "You're blushing," and you're not blushing, that's enough to make you blush. And eye contact is the ultimate common knowledge generator because you're looking at the part of the person that's looking at the part of you, that's looking at the part of them, that's looking at the part of you ad infinitum, which is why eye contact is such a potent signal in human interaction. Not just humans, it also operates in other species. Often, in other species, usually as a threat signal. In humans, I cite my late colleague Irv DeVore, who we were talking about before, who used to tell his class in behavioral biology, if any two humans look into each other's eyes for more than 5 seconds, then either they're going to have sex or one's going to kill the other. Although a bit of an exaggeration. I think that eye contact makes private knowledge common, as in, can you look me in the eye and say that? That's what you say when there's knowledge that each of you have that has not been commonly acknowledged yet. Anyway, going back to laughter, I suggest that laughter is a common knowledge generator of some infirmity, weakness, indignity, loss of dignity, and that it can be used either aggressively to take someone down a few notches as kind of a counter-dominance strategy, or it can be used convivially to, when there is a communal sharing relationship, you need to signal that it's not a hierarchical authority ranking relationship, even though any two people together, one's bound to be better looking, richer, smarter, more powerful than the other. But if the idea is that we're friends, you want to keep reinforcing the idea we're all equals here. And so if you use a self-deprecating joke, if there's gentle teasing, which is accepted, and there's a lot of that in convivial interactions, it's signaling we know that the basis of our relationship is equality and not hierarchy or authority. But there's generally a target of humor, someone whose dignity has been lowered. And one thing that insight that I reproduced in the book from, I don't know if did you know Provine, William Provine? Mm-hmm. Robert Provine, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. So he did something quite radical in the study of humor. There have been lots of speculations about humor. Sigmund Freud wrote a book about it, Henri Bergson. But what none of them ever did was actually go out and record what makes people laugh. Mm. So they started out with jokes, but jokes are generally not a trigger for laughing. So Provine just went out with a tape recorder, or he had his students just, as they were in social interactions, just write down, every time someone laughs, write down what made them laugh. And virtually none of them were funny. He said, life is the most badly scripted situation comedy ever. And try it. Next time you're in a social gathering, it's usually just, often a laugh line is something like, well, what is that supposed to mean? Or you've got to be kidding. Cases where there's some minor breach of decorum or minor indignity or frustration or a change of expectation, usually making someone a little bit less dignified, a little less, giving a little less gravitas than before the incident, acknowledged by laughter. And what the laughter does is it, especially since laughter is contagious, it generates the common knowledge of what the infirmity is. Something that previously was private knowledge is made common knowledge by the laughter, which is why laughter can also be, I said it can be used convivially, but it can also be used aggressively. And a number of sages have pointed this out. There's a saying, in risu veritas, in laughter there is truth, or laughter is the most scathing weapon. And I give the example of the famous National Press Correspondents' Dinner in Washington in, I think it was 2015 or 2014. This is where people roast other celebrities, and the expectation is that you take it in good fun. Well, one year, Barack Obama roasted Donald Trump, who at the time was a reality TV star and a real estate developer.
And a conspiracy theorist.
And conspiracy theorist. And Trump, as you may recall, had spread the conspiracy theory that Obama had not been born in the United States, but he had been born in Kenya. And so Obama had just released his birth certificate to quell these rumors. He said, well, I've already released my birth certificate, and now I'm actually going to release my birth video. And he shows the scene from The Lion King, in which the newborn lion cub is presented. And then Obama added, and to the Fox News table, that was a joke. And then he said, I think there'd been some rumors about Trump being president. He said that I think Trump would make a very good president. He could, for example, finally close Guantanamo because he has a history of running real estate property into the ground. Now, this was the kind of unkindest cut of all because it called attention to the fact that Trump had multiple bankruptcies, and Trump's claim to fame was being a successful businessman. And so the camera showed, amid all of the merriment and laughter, Trump was visibly fuming. And there was one story that he got the idea to run for president as kind of revenge and redemption for that evening.
Yes.
But anyway, it shows
here
how...
we are.
And here we are, yes.
Yes. All right, let's wrap it up with the last chapter of your book on radical honesty. Why can't we just be honest with each other? This reminded me of remember those Geico commercials? Can Geico save you 20% on insurance? And then they, give you the line, one of which was Abraham Lincoln really honest? And then they show, an Abe character and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, says, does this dress make my backside look big? And he says, well, maybe just, and she just blows up. Why should he lie? Why not just be honest?
Yeah, so there is, the last chapter raises this question. And I note that it has been played in certain dystopian comedies, like the Jim Carrey movie Liar, Liar, where the scriptwriter imagines a world in which, through various science fiction contrivances, one or more characters is forced to be honest and incapable of lying. And you watch the various imbroglios play out. And there are cases in which kind of the white lies, the hypocrisies, don't only characterize our social life, couples, friends, and so on, but even significant international relations. So an example is our country's official relationship with Taiwan. Now, in reality, Taiwan it's obviously a sovereign state. It's got a capital, it's got a government, it's got its own currency, and so on. The official policy of the United States is that it does not exist. Likewise of the European Union, likewise of the United Nations. So it's a form of systematic hypocrisy. Another example is Israel will neither confirm nor deny that it has nuclear weapons. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. Now, it's a good thing in both these cases that this hypocrisy exists. If Israel denied it had nuclear weapons, then there'd be no point in having nuclear weapons because it wouldn't be a deterrent. If it's its official policy that it did, then Egypt and Syria and Saudi Arabia would be forced to get their own nuclear weapons so as not to accept kind of second-class status with respect to Israel. Likewise, if the United States ever officially extended diplomatic recognition to Taiwan, it would be seen as an affront to the People's Republic of China, which has staked its own status, preeminence, credibility on being the rulers of all of historic China. So literally, the fate of the world depends on those examples of systematic hypocrisy. Keeping what is private knowledge out of common knowledge is the way I examine it. In the case of a couple where there are certain things that each one knows. So surveys show that a large majority of people have sexual fantasies that don't just consist of monogamous intercourse.
What?
So this is surveys show. So
Not us.
everyone knows this, and if you're not naive, you've got to know that your partner, being a human being, maybe they have as well, but still you'd be ill-advised to tell your husband, I sometimes fantasize about having sex with your brother or your best friend. Now that might be true, but it's best not to make that common knowledge. Or among friends, we've been on the phone for 20 minutes, but 20 minutes of you is I've enjoyed it a lot, but it's really all I can take, and now I have more important things to do. Now, you know that that's true, and you've got to know that it's got to be true of your friend, in some circumstances. Again, blurting it out makes a big difference. Or your boss, I think, you say to your boss, I think you often make stupid decisions and force me to waste my time with bullshit tasks. You probably think that, but again, it's probably not a good idea to blurt it out. I mean, there are circumstances in which, when things go to an extreme, you have to blurt it out. And those are very awkward, but sometimes in life you have to court awkward moments. But most of the time, you don't. And the reason is, and this relates to the earlier conversation about why we speak in innuendo and euphemism, that human relationships depend on certain common assumptions. In the case of communal sharing, it's infinite sharing and fusion, considering the other person's interests as equal to your own. These are fictions. They're not literally true, but they're the base. They're what makes friends friends. They're what makes lovers lovers. It's what makes what gives a person in a position in authority their authority. So if you are completely honest and you point out that these common assumptions are fictions, you're undermining the basis of the relationship. And sometimes the relationship is more important than the particular issue that you want to call attention to. Now again, there are, just that very description opens the door to cases where there really are exceptions. Say if one person really is being exploited, as in the case of the asymmetry in the dinner party invitations, or in the case of a marriage, one person could, even though the whole point of a marriage is you don't keep track, you don't keep score, but sometimes a person gets exploited, and you do have to reach the uncomfortable moment, often encouraged by, say, a marital therapist. You've been suffering too long because of an unstated compact between you that the other person is exploiting. You've got to screw up the courage and actually confront them, make it common knowledge, in cases where the asymmetry is too gross to be to keep the status quo.
It's like your examples of the taboo dinner conversations, like you're at a dinner party with a bunch of couples, say, of course, none of us would ever cheat on our spouses, but if you would do it, who would it be with?
Yeah, it's not a game that you should.
The only answer is, I'm outraged you would even ask. Right?
I have the example in a real-life case in my previous book, Rationality, where the dinner party conversation was turned to, of course, none of us is racist, but just hypothetically, if you were racist, what group would you be racist toward? And someone that I know dumped her boyfriend when he said, when his answer was Jews. She was Jewish. So that's another case in which radical honesty is not such a great idea.
All right, we're ready to go to the audience.
How could you help me respond to people who are cheering on the Washington Post review of your book? I must confess, I only got through the first few paragraphs before I realized it wasn't a book review, but more of a takedown of you. But about half of the 46 commenters so far are actually cheering on the reviewer. But so what is your response or your reaction to that review?
Well, it's it's very hard to do that because naturally you'd respond to a negative review. So whether or not the review is fair, no author getting a negative review ever thinks the review is fair. But having established that, I mean, it was just filled with errors, starting with her definition of common knowledge, where since common knowledge, if I know that you know something and you know that I know something, and that's just false. For common knowledge, it has to be an infinite set of states of mutual knowledge, not just two. There are, I mean, I could go through it. In fact, the reviewer is actually or was a graduate student in philosophy at Harvard, who just never either dropped out of the program or didn't do a dissertation. So I kind of tempted in kind of grading it like a professor. But I think that would not be in my interests. But it was so filled with errors. And so the question is why is there, it was just an article of just sheer hatred. She just, just detested everything that I stood for with the error. And I mean, I won't go through the list of errors such as, well, I'll mention one other, that I have no respect for the humanities, but common knowledge actually came out of the humanities, as I note that it came out of philosophy, and the book is filled with examples from novels and movies and screenplays. But anyway, so where did all the bile come from? And I think I do know. So Michael began the evening talking about the two cultures from, based on the famous essay by C.P. Snow in 1959, in which he bemoaned the fact that in the England of his time, there was a great deal of prestige that went to the cultural critics, the literary analysts, and a kind of contempt toward the sciences as somehow kind of plumbers or engineers, and that he called for greater recognition, sort of greater bridging. In fact, the term third culture came from Snow. But I have seen, as someone who does try to bridge the two cultures, that there is rage from many people in the humanities over anyone approaching their subject matter from a scientific background. And since all my books do that, in each one of my books I've gotten an absolutely bilious review from some cultural critic or humanities professor that just like a red mist descends, and they just can't even see what's literally stated in page 1 of the book. That's the very idea just fills them with anger. It could be, I think the influence of the humanities, especially in universities, has been declining at the expense of the huge rise in the sciences, including sciences that do encroach on the subject matter of the humanities, like linguistics, like archaeology, like psychology, particularly evolutionary psychology. And even at conferences where some funder, in the spirit of Snow, says, well, let's bring the scientists and humanities into the same room and they can have a conversation and dialogue, it never ends well. The people in the humanities inevitably are just indignant that scientists should have anything to say about their subject matter. Anyway, that's my theory as to what's going on there. Plus, I mean, the other thing is that I'm a kind of a political centrist. I'm eclectic, but a lot of the humanities and some reviewers are really on the hard left, and just being in the center is itself a kind of outrage. Pushing back against left-wing cancel culture and censorship and shaming mobs, especially in universities, but also in the press, in nonprofits and cultural institutions. The factions that are actually fomenting that culture war feel very defensive to the point of rage at someone who kind of calls that out, as I do in one of the chapters of the book.
Thank you. At the risk of almost saying, I feel like this is the elephant in the room. I know that you have a lot that you've spoken and written about artificial intelligence. I mean, how would you address that question as a threat to common knowledge?
Well, it could be a threat. It isn't necessarily a threat. It could be a threat to the extent that in particular, I assume you're referring not just to AI in general, but to large language models. Because no two people get the same response to a query of a large language models, and because the models themselves take into account your history of prompts, it at least poses the threat that, unlike, say, looking up an article, in an Encyclopedia Britannica or even Wikipedia, where two people know that they're looking at the same article, and each one could know that the other's looking at the same article. If you look it up, if you ask ChatGPT, there's no reason to think that someone else asking the same question is going to get the same answer. This might be the next step from the fractionation that we see from social media and cable news networks, where, unlike the days in which the common knowledge was almost nationwide, everyone heard Walter Cronkite and Johnny Carson and read Time magazine and watched 60 Minutes. Now, the common knowledge is, or more accurately, common belief, because some of it isn't knowledge, but they're in several mutually exclusive networks in which things are common knowledge within, but not across the networks, thanks to cable news networks and then social media. There's at least a possibility that bespoke answers to factual questions, often attempting to appeal to your prejudices, what you want to hear, could further fractionate the intellectual landscape.
Your mother, Roz, was the greatest high school guidance counselor that ever was.
Aw.
Wow.
I'm wondering if Dr. Pinker would share any influence his mother had on him.
Nice.
Yes. Well, and I do mention my late mother in the acknowledgments of the book. Well, kind of based on what I know as a psychologist, and kind of informed by biology, I have to confess that the greatest influence she had on me was at the moment of conception. Which sounds like not a nice thing to say about your mother, but my mother, I think, to give her the credit that she deserves, she knows that I wrote a number of books about the greater effect of genes than on parenting practices. And since she herself was a sophisticated intellectual reader, she didn't take it personally. She was kind of intrigued to learn that. And so I think I would say in recognition of my mother that she really was a thinker. She didn't interpret everything through the lens of what does it mean to me, and she was always the first reader of my manuscripts. I imagine writing for her, and again, this is going back to our original conversation of what assumptions did I bring to the task of writing for a wide audience. I avoid the academic's unfortunate cliche of saying, well, I want to write something that my mother could understand in a condescending sense of, or someone who loves me but isn't particularly sophisticated or isn't as smart as I am. I would give my mother first drafts precisely because she was an intellectually sophisticated reader. So I have to say, though, her influence, in addition to half of my DNA, was that our house was filled with magazines and books. There were conversations, debates over the dinner table. She encouraged my career. There was although I think initially she would have rather that I become a doctor. But
you mean a medical doctor? You are a doctor.
I guess, or as she might have said, a doctor.
Doctor.
So I do owe my mother a great deal, and I dedicate my first popular book to my parents, and Rationality I dedicated to her.
Could you talk a little bit about how some of the distinctions you've been talking about intersect with the internet? Because it feels like they're more everyone's now. Everyone knowing that everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows, and how you think about the impact of billions of people knowing.
Yeah, so there was a couple of things. And I do talk about how, particularly social media, so this isn't just the internet, but a particular application of the internet, which became so wildly popular, gives rise to this strange phenomenon that no one predicted of shaming mobs. That there's a perception in social media, even though technically they don't generate common knowledge because they're delivered to you in a personalized feed. As far as you know, you're the only one seeing a particular tweet, unlike, say, 60 Minutes or Time Magazine. But it kind of feels like common knowledge, partly because it could become common knowledge because of the virality generators, the like, the repost, the retweet buttons, since that could lead to exponential dissemination. For all you know, it could become common knowledge, and moreover, you're not just receiving common knowledge, you could generate common knowledge. You could post something that could go viral, amplified by the fact that many of the social media platforms have trending columns or the equivalent, where you're seeing what is popular, and therefore if you repost it, it could get more popular still. And so it feels like social media are a big public arena, whether or not they are. And one of the features of social and moral norms, ways that people behave that isn't enforced by incentives, but exists because everyone knows that it exists, is that they occur in the arena of common knowledge, things that are public that everyone can see. Therefore, they exist only if violations are policed again, in the arena of common knowledge. So if someone breaches a norm, if they say something that could be interpreted as racist, then there's an upwelling of feeling that they have to be punished in some way, but the punishment itself cannot be private. It must be commonly perceived for the norm to survive. So in an analogy to the way that punishments in the criminal justice system used to be public, used to have public hangings and guillotinings and even the pillories and stocks where a person was just humiliated in a public square in order for it to be known that it is known that this is not something that one does. The phenomenon of piling on some victim in social media, I think, follows that dynamic, with the additional twist that people can gain sort of a certain amount of kudos or credit from the community by being the one who polices a norm. And that can be done at very low cost with social media. You pile on, you don't have the feedback of face-to-face reaction, but you feel like you're joining in the campaign to against racism, against transphobia, and now with Charlie Kirk against the assault on conservative values of the conservative coalition, as the case may be. Now, another part of the answer is that what I think we've learned, I think we weren't sufficiently aware of this 20 years ago, is that the mere dissemination of information, which the internet, of course, does at low cost, does not suffice to align that information with the truth. So it's not so much common knowledge as common belief. Knowledge has to be true for it to count as knowledge. That one of the things Michael and I earlier today were talking about, an excellent little book called The Constitution of Knowledge by Jonathan Rauch, which pointed out that unless an informational ecosystem is specifically engineered to pursue truth, it won't. That there'll be fake news, conspiracy theories, paranormal, woo-woo, all kinds of nonsense that easily proliferate, that to align common belief with the truth, with common knowledge, you've got to have mechanisms like fact-checking, editing, empirical testing, publication of corrections, codes, a commitment to the truth as kind of an overarching common assumption. So newspapers until the 20th century were like today's social media, basically disseminators of what we now call fake news. Typical newspaper would have stories of Martian civilizations and babies born with two heads and talking animals and false accusations of politicians from the other party. And they finally got their act together early in the 20th century, and there were associations of journalistic ethics and norms where they said, we've got to cut out all this stuff and make ourselves credible. Likewise, in scientific societies, there are norms like replicability, testability, free speech, open debate. In criminal justice system. There are standards of what evidence can be introduced in a trial and what are ruled out. Unless you have these specific mechanisms to get at the truth, then you just won't. Truth is very difficult and kind of an exotic concept, and it has to be engineered. Even Wikipedia, if you sign on, even with all its flaws, Wikipedia does a much better job than, say, Twitter. And that's because the Wikipedians have to commit themselves to objectivity, sourcing, checking, editing, and the mechanisms are designed to make that happen.
On Twitter recently, somebody was asking about Charlie Kirk debate with these college students where he would get up there with a microphone and 20 of them would line up and hammer him. And I thought, wow, that's incredible what he does. I've done dozens of debates. I would not want to do that. That's really intense. But then I got to thinking, when I got a little pushback, is Charlie Kirk trying to find the truth about some particular topic when he's engaging with these liberal students? The answer is no, of course. He already knows the answer. He's just trying to convince them this is the conservative position. You really should think about this or convert. And this is why I'm sort of thinking debates are not a good format for this. In conversation with, say, a theist would be a far more productive way of, let's see if we can find some common ground here and just go back and forth, rather than I'm trying to win, which is what most debates are. I'm just trying to win the debate, like a lawyer rather than a scientist.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I don't take part in Oxford-style debates with a resolution and a refutation and
a vote.
And a vote.
Yeah.
I did it once because they paid me a lot of money. I did it once at Harvard to help a student society that was starting them. But for precisely that reason, they actually don't have the rules that steer you toward the truth, because they select for debating tricks, for shutting the other person up, for diverting the conversation to, and they're not a sound means of getting. I mean, debates in the looser sense of two people with different opinions airing their opinions and trying to determine what's right, what's wrong. And part of the relatively new rationality community, which I write about in a little bit here, and because the rationality community is actually quite interested in questions of common knowledge. But they have norms such as steel manning the opposition, the opposite of setting up a straw man to knock it down. You argue against the strongest possible version of the opponent that you can assemble. Adversarial collaboration, where two opponents get together with the help of a mediator and agree a priori on what would be an empirical test that would settle the issue before the actual data are gathered or the experiment is run, so you can't kind of move the goalposts after the data are in. Betting, being willing to actually make put your money where your mouth is. As Alex Tabarrok said, a bet is a tax on bullshit. And actually, Michael, give the example that you
so
in the green room.
a couple of years ago I started, because I've been in the UFO, UAP community for a while, and for 30 years I've been hearing disclosure is coming any day now, like this year for sure. So I've taken it now saying, all right, I'll put up $1,000. You put up $1,000. Let's say by December 31st, 2026, or whatever date you want to pick, it'll happen or it won't happen. And what's the it? Well, like the equivalent of the Chinese spy balloon. Everybody knows, you can all see it. The president, the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense, War, whatever. Everybody says that's real, okay? The equivalent of that. And no one will take me up on it. It seems to be they like to say it's coming. And then I had a recent exchange with Garry Kasparov, the great chess player who's a strong critic of Trump, who says, he was just saying on Twitter, I think we may not even have 2026 midterms. And for sure, probably 2028 elections won't happen. I'm like, really? I'll give you $1,000.
Yeah.
If they happen, well, I'm not saying they won't happen. I'm saying they'll happen, but they'll be like in Russia where it's all rigged. It's like, okay, really? I mean, so at some point, if you can't quantify what exactly an operational definition is exactly what we mean, like your bet with Sir Martin Rees. Like, what would be the criteria for the number of, that die from a pandemic or whatever that was?
Yeah.
You know, something quite clear. And most people, what were you saying today? That it's more like a public expression of their outrage or something, not a specific prediction.
Yeah, well, most people's, this is a theme of again, going my previous book, Rationality. It makes an appearance in this one, too, in talking about why academics are all too happy to censor and punish people for expressing opinions in the one arena where you'd expect that voicing opinions is just the coin of the realm. Why should academics, of all people, shut each other up and fire each other, censor each other? And part of the answer is that the idea that your opinions about factual matters are actually assessments of reality is a very unusual, exotic, unnatural human concept for most people most of the time, at least when it comes to not things that you can actually see in front of you, immediate experience, but any larger question. Why are some groups more successful than others? What's the cause of depressions? What is the cause of disease? What is the origin of the human species? Until recently, you couldn't find out, no one knew, and so your beliefs were expressions of what kind of person you are. They were expressions of your moral values, your sacred myths, and the idea that these are actual factual matters where there is an objective answer and we are capable of seeking it and determining it. Even academics who ought to think that way find it very unnatural. Mm-hmm. By the way, I should add, when it comes to reports of weird phenomena such as paranormal phenomena, miracles, visits from aliens, Michael is the world's expert on attempts to get to the bottom of them. So if anyone ever asks you about the miracle at Lourdes or the statue that shed tears on Easter, Michael knows the research.
Most people don't want to, really, they don't want to know the skeptical position. It's like the ancient aliens. I've been bugging these guys. I know a bunch of them. Why don't you have like a skeptic on? What?
Let me just throw out one other idea, since we've been talking about the rationality community. But one of their, if you call it saints, is a mathematician, an Israeli mathematician, Robert Aumann, who published 50 years ago a famous theorem called the agree to disagree theorem, which I discuss in the book. And there's one chapter in which I present, as opposed to the phenomena that we've been discussing this evening, which are kind of adjacent to common sense. You can appreciate them just having them verbally described. There are a number of theorems of common knowledge that are not at all obvious, and they reinforce the idea that this is really a logically distinct state. There's a difference between everyone knowing something, even knowing that the other one knows it, and this infinite set of nested beliefs. And the famous theorem from Aumann, it's in a 3-page article, is that rational, I can say it in words, and rational agents with the same background understanding of the world, technically the same priors, who make their assessments common knowledge. In other words, each one tells the other what his or her judgment of a hypothesis is. Those judgments may not differ. That is, in other words, rational agents cannot agree to disagree. Now that sounds very intolerant and dogmatic, because isn't agreeing to disagree kind of the goal of civil discourse and constructive debate? And he says, at least under the conditions of this theorem, that is, the priors, that namely your background assumptions are the same, and then you can ask, why would they be the same? And your posteriors, again using the lingo of Bayes' theorem, but a way of putting it is the conclusion that you come to after examining the evidence. If they're common knowledge, if you know what the other guys are, if he knows what yours are, and so on, then they must be the same. Which means that if you string it out in time, if you have two people on opposite sides of an issue, and they're each presenting their assessment, and you take into account the other person's assessment and vice versa, you don't get what we assume should happen in a rational argument. Namely, two reasonable people will start off far apart, and when they exchange their opinions, they get closer and closer, and they meet somewhere in the middle. So that's not the way a rational argument ought to work at all. When you think about it, why should the truth just happen to fall halfway in between what two people think, two people's opinions? They're just opinions. So that rationally, it could be it's a random walk that that the two opinions could cross, they could zigzag, and then at the very last step, converge. The basic intuition behind it, the math, even though it's expressed in just a couple of pages, is difficult to follow exactly. I lead the reader through a simpler version of it. The basic idea is, why should your opinion count more than the other person's just because you're you and they aren't? I mean, if they're both rational assessments of the state of affairs, it shouldn't matter whether it occurred to you or occurred to the other person's. Once the other person expresses their assessment, you should take it into account just as if you yourself thought about it a few minutes ago. And the result is that rational arguments ought to be a random walk, not like haggling over a price. And there's no reason that two rational agents, at least if they start out with the same understanding, shouldn't end up in the same place. One or the other is being irrational if they disagree after sharing their assessments.
Do you know Isaac Asimov's essay, The Relativity of Wrong? He says, when people thought the earth was flat, they were wrong. When people thought the earth was a perfect sphere, they were wrong. But if you think that the people who thought the earth was flat are just as wrong as the people who thought the earth was a sphere, you're wronger than both of them, right? It's an oblate sphere. So, I mean, there is some way to get closer to the truth. So, when I'm debating a theist on the origins of the universe or life or whatever, and they have their arguments, and then we have our arguments, and we go back and forth, what you're saying is that at some point we can't just say, let's just agree to disagree. I mean, somebody's either right or wrong, or maybe we just hit an epistemological wall where we just say, I don't know what was before the Big Bang. Nobody knows. We just can't get at the answer.
Yeah, so according to this theorem, again, like all theorems, they pertain to particular idealizations. But, it's framed in terms of Bayes' theorem, but although the terms in Bayes' theorem have kind of escaped and become part of our common vocabulary. Like if you're familiar with the term priors, you know something about Bayes' theorem because that's where it comes from. That is, it's your degree of credence in a hypothesis before looking at any evidence. Posteriors are your degree of credence. That is, you don't accept or reject a hypothesis, but you assign some degree of probability between 0 and 1. So if you start out with the same priors, then you make your posteriors common knowledge. And what's counterintuitive about it is you don't have to give the evidence itself on which you base your opinion, just your degree of confidence. So let's say it's a factual question, like what was the source of the SARS-CoV-2 virus? Was it a wet market or a lab leak? Or who killed JFK? Was it just a lone shooter or more than one? So if you say, let's say in the case of the virus, my posterior, after looking at all the evidence, is that there's a 0.6 chance that it came from a lab. Someone else says, well, mine is 0.4. Well, according to the theorem, they can't both be right, and so all they have to do is exchange the 0.6 and the 0.4, and they will, and repeatedly do that as each one updates in response to the others, and they have to end up in the same place. And that is not, here's the reason that my assessment is 0.6. So here you can see all the basis of why I came to that conclusion. The surprising part of the theorem is you don't have to do that. All you have to say is 0.6, and the other guy has to say 0.4, and then you go back and forth. And it isn't that you then converge on 0.5 either. It could be that after I hear your 0.4, I might go to 0.7 or 0.2, and that can go back and forth until you end up in the same value. That's what's surprising about the theorem.
Yeah, but here I'm just thinking, at some point, again, you hit that epistemological wall and the person, and I say, nobody knows what there was before the Big Bang or whatever. And the other person says, yeah, and that's where I put God as the creator. And I say, well, I don't really need that hypothesis. And then you just kind of go back and forth, and it becomes kind of a subjective, personal. I'm comfortable with just saying, I don't know, nobody knows. And the other person says, well, then why not postulate a creator? And then where do you go from there?
Yeah. Well, needless to say, the rational agents in Allman's theorem are not necessarily human beings.
Okay, I see. Okay.
And in fact, I do discuss in the book, and just when I present the theorem in as clear form as possible, but then I discuss what does it say about human argumentation. How come humans aren't like the rational agents in Allman's theorem? So where do we diverge? Is it that our priors are different? And I'm an optimist, you're a pessimist, or I'm a Christian and you're a Jew or an atheist. Is it that we want to win the argument rather than converge on the truth? And so I use it as a springboard for what is it about ordinary flesh and blood humans that make them not like rational agents.
My name is Preston. I'm a student at Cal State Fullerton. Most of the discussion tonight has focused around sort of human organization and human common knowledge. I was wondering if you could provide a few remarks with regards to, say, non-human forms, like what, if any, is the role of common knowledge within non-humans, like animals?
Well, there is, so there are phenomena of where animals have to coordinate. That is, they have to make arbitrary choices that are adaptive only if other organisms make those same arbitrary choices. And therefore, they need the equivalent of common knowledge, although not necessarily in the form of the recursive mentalizing of I know that she knows that I know that she knows, since many animals can't do that the way humans do. But they sometimes have hardwired into them a response to some salient, commonly observed signal that that allows them to coordinate by the same logic as common knowledge. So I give the example of what marine biologists call the Great Barrier Reef Annual Sex Festival, which is when coral, which, by the way, don't even have a brain, so they really don't have recursive beliefs, but they do face the coordination problem of, since they are sessile, they can't go and find a mate, they spew eggs and sperm into the briny deep, and they hope they find their counterpart from some other coral. Now, how do they manage this? Well, if they can't spew gametes 24/7, because that's too expensive, they ideally would spew them at the same time that other coral are spewing them so that the egg can find the sperm. And they coordinate on a public signal, namely the full moon. So different species will release their gametes either the day of the full moon or exactly 5 days after the full moon, but the full moon is the equivalent of a common knowledge generator that helps them solve the coordination problem. And there are other species that have evolved hardwired, rigid solutions to the coordination problem in terms of public signals following the same logic. What's unusual about humans is that we aren't locked into only one signal and one behavior, but we can come up with all kinds of public signals, coronations and investitures and inaugurations and bar mitzvahs and weddings and public rallies, of generating common knowledge that traffic lights, zebra crossings, I go through many examples, where we can kind of mix and match our signals and our solutions to coordination games in an endless number of ways. But other animals facing this problem evolved hardwired solutions.
So would a predator-prey relationship be like that? The prey knows the predator wants to eat it. The predator knows that the prey knows that the predator wants to eat it, and they kind of go back and forth, and they evolve these mechanisms to avoid this.
Well, and of which the foremost is eye contact.
Yeah.
So you know that, many of us know when you learn it as a kid. If there is a snarling dog, and you don't want to be chased by the dog, you don't look it in the eye. That is a way, since
Right.
Both the how does a predator know what's a prey and vice versa? Well, if the prey sees the predator kind of drawing a bead on it, and the predator sees the prey looking warily at it, then kind of each one knows that the other one knows that they're in that relationship. And so if you don't look the dog in the eye, you're less likely to be chased by the dog.
Good advice for tonight.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Michael.